the architect of revenge, the untold will. The fog that morning didn't just roll over the hills, it crawled. Thick and grey, swallowing the jagged iron gates of the Blackwood estate. It felt like the earth itself was trying to hide what was about to happen inside. To the world, today was a day of mourning for Magnus Blackwood, the titan of industry, the man who turned steel into gold. But inside the mahogany-paneled study, the only thing breathing was greed. I stood in the corner, a place I had occupied for 23 years. To my left stood a marble bust of a Roman emperor, and to my right, the three people who shared my father's blood but none of his soul. They didn't see me, they never did. To them, I was Leo, the stray dog Magnus had brought home from an alleyway in a fit of misplaced charity. I was the one who carried their bags, the one who took the blame when they broke the vintage crystal, and the one who sat by the old man's bed for 6 months while they were busy spending their future inheritance in the clubs of Monaco and Dubai. In a house built on secrets, the person who says the least is usually the one who knows where all the bodies are buried. Liam, the eldest, was pacing like a caged tiger. His suit was a bespoke three-piece that cost more than a family sedan. But it couldn't hide the sweat soaking through his silk shirt. He was the heir apparent, a man whose only talent was losing money faster than his father could make it. Next to him sat Sophia, her face a mask of cold, calculated grief. She was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But she wasn't crying, she was checking her reflection in the glass of a framed painting, ensuring her morning look was perfect for the press cameras waiting at the gate. And then there was Jax, the youngest, the brat. He was slumped in a leather armchair, yawning, his eyes bloodshot from a night of heavy drinking. "Where is that coward Sterling?" Liam snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "He's been the family lawyer for 40 years. He knows the rules. The body isn't even in the ground. And he's keeping us waiting like we're applying for a loan." "Relax, Liam," Sophia purred, though her voice had a sharp, metallic edge. "The longer he takes, the more time you have to figure out how you're going to pay back that 8-figure debt to the Cayman creditors. We all know you've been dipping into the company's emergency reserves." Liam froze, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. "Watch your mouth, Sophia, or I'll make sure your allowance is the first thing I cut when I take the CEO chair." They were already tearing each other apart for the meat, unaware that the trap had been set months before the lion died. I watched them, my heart a cold stone in my chest. I remembered the night Magnus died. It was 3 a.m., the room smelling of antiseptic and faded cigars. He had reached out his thin, skeletal hand and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Leo," he had whispered, his eyes burning with a final, desperate clarity. "They think I'm giving him a kingdom. But a kingdom is only as strong as the people who guard it. Give them exactly what they want. Let them choke on it." The heavy oak doors groaned open. Mr. Sterling walked in, looking like a man who had just finished a marathon. He carried a heavy leather briefcase that seemed to weigh 100 pounds. Behind him, 2 assistants carried stacks of folders. The siblings straightened up immediately, their eyes locking onto the briefcase like sharks sensing blood in the water. "Please, have a seat," Sterling said, his voice flat and weary. He didn't look at the siblings. He looked at me, a brief, microsecond nod, the signal. "We don't need seats, Sterling," Jax groaned, standing up. "Just open the damn box. How much did the old man leave in the secret vault? That's all we care about." "The will of Magnus Blackwood is a complex instrument," Sterling began, ignoring the outburst. He spent his final months restructuring every asset, every offshore account, and every deed. He wanted to ensure that his legacy was handled with precision. Precision is just another word for a surgical strike. It hits the target before they even hear the sound of the shot. Sterling opened the first red folder. First, the primary assets. To Liam Blackwood, as the eldest son, Your father bequeathed the Blackwood Hotel Group and a 30% controlling interest in the parent corporation. Liam let out a breath he had been holding for an hour. A smirk spread across his face. Finally, the throne is mine. To Sophia Blackwood, Sterling continued, the estate bequeaths the global real estate portfolio, including the villas in Tuscany, the penthouse in Manhattan, and the private island in the Maldives, along with the family's collection of historical jewelry. Sophia leaned back, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She glanced at me, her lip curling in a sneer. I told you, Leo, servants get the scraps, family gets the feast. And to Jax Blackwood, Sterling read, the sum of $50 million in liquid cash, plus the entirety of the luxury car collection and the vintage wine cellar. Jax pumped his fist. Hell yes, Vegas. Here I come. They were laughing now, the tension breaking into a grotesque celebration. They were already talking about renovations, about selling off the pieces they didn't like, about how they would finally erase their father's boring legacy and replace it with their own. But in this house, the floor was never solid, it was a thin layer of gold leaf over a bottomless pit. There is a final section, Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. The room went silent again. Regarding the crown jewel, the private vault, the legendary blueprints for the zero-point energy patents and the uncut diamonds Magnus acquired in the 80s. The siblings leaned so far forward they were almost falling out of their chairs. This was the real prize. This was the infinite money they had dreamed of. To access the vault and the final hidden accounts, Sterling said, there is a legal prerequisite. Magnus was very firm on this. You must sign a global acceptance of liability and asset transfer. It is a document that confirms you accept your portion of the inheritance, as is, waiving any future right to sue the estate or contest the distribution. You take the wealth, and you take the responsibility that comes with it. Where's the pen? Liam demanded, not even looking at the document. Liam, wait, Sophia said, her instinct for self-preservation flaring for a second. Liability? What kind of liability? It's standard corporate language. Sophia, Liam snapped, grabbing the gold-plated pen from the desk. He's just making sure we don't sue each other for more. If I don't sign, I don't get the hotels. If you don't sign, you lose the villas. Do you want to gamble your future over a piece of legalese? When greed holds the pen, the hand doesn't tremble until it's far too late to stop the ink. One by one, they signed. Liam's signature was bold and arrogant. Sophia's was elegant and sharp. Jax's was a messy scrawl. They pushed the papers back to Sterling, their faces glowing with the thrill of the win. I stood there, watching the ink dry. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in the library with Magnus, studying the very laws they were now blindly ignoring. He had taught me how to read between the lines, while he had taught them only how to spend. Done, Liam said, slapping the table. Now, give us the key to the vault. We're finished here. Mr. Sterling didn't reach for a key. He reached for a small, handheld blacklight device. He clicked it on and swept it over the final page of the document they had just signed. Under the ultraviolet light, a hidden line of text began to glow, a sentence written in invisible, permanent ink that had been integrated into the paper itself. The most dangerous traps aren't hidden in the woods, they are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the light of truth to expose them. Sterling's face turned into a mask of pure ice. He looked at the three heirs with a look that wasn't fear, it was mourning. He began to read the hidden sentence, and as the words left his lips, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Part 3, The Frozen Sentence. The lawyer didn't just stop reading, he stopped breathing, his eyes locking onto a truth that had been hidden in the fibers of the paper. Mr. Sterling's hand, which had been steady for 40 years of high-stakes litigation, began to tremble. The black light in his other hand flickered, casting a ghostly violet glow over the signatures of the three siblings. He looked at Liam, then at Sophia, and finally at Jax, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "What is it, Sterling?" Liam demanded, leaning so far over the desk his tie dipped into the crystal inkwell. "Read the damn line. We signed it. The assets are ours. What could possibly be written there that has you looking like you've seen your own ghost?" Sterling swallowed. A dry, sandpaper sound in the silence of the room. He whispered the sentence, but in the dead quiet of the library, it sounded like a thunderclap. "The named heirs hereby acknowledge that all transferred assets are currently cross-collateralized against a $3 billion predatory loan used to mask the insolvency of the Blackwood Group's offshore shells." For 5 seconds, there was no sound, not even the wind against the windows. Then, the realization hit Liam like a physical blow. He slumped back into his chair, his face turning a mottled, sickly gray. $3 billion, Sophia whispered, her voice a thin wire about to snap. "Insolvency, that's impossible. The company is a titan. It's the gold standard." "It was a facade," Sterling said, his voice regaining a jagged edge of professional coldness. "Your father didn't build a kingdom for you. He built a labyrinth. He spent the last decade funneling every real cent of profit into a private foundation, one that none of you have access to keep the company looking wealthy for the public. He took out massive, high-interest loans from private creditors who, let's just say, they don't use lawyers to collect their debts. They had spent their lives waiting to inherit a fortune, never realizing they were actually inheriting a target on their backs." "The signatures," Jax stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "We can just tear them up. We didn't know. It's fraud." "It's not fraud, Jax," I said, stepping forward from the shadows. My voice was the only calm thing in the room. "It's a contract. You were given the opportunity to audit the books before signing. You were offered the chance to have your own legal counsel present. But you were so afraid that if you waited, one of your siblings would get a bigger piece that you rushed to sign the global acceptance without reading the fine print." I looked at Liam, whose expensive suit now looked like a shroud. "You wanted the hotels, Liam. They're yours, along with the $400 million in unpaid property taxes and the structural safety violations that will cost another $100 million to fix. Sophia, those villas, they're currently being seized by the Italian and French governments for back taxes. And Jax, your liquid cash is sitting in an account that was frozen by the feds 10 minutes after you signed that paper." Part 4, the psychological collapse. When the ceiling starts to fall, the first thing people do isn't run for the door, it's claw at the people they used to call family. The transformation in the room was horrific to witness. The grief-stricken siblings turned into rabid animals in a matter of seconds. "This is your fault," Sophia screamed, lunging at Liam, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at his face. "You told us to sign. You said it was standard. You wanted to be CEO so bad you sold us all into debt." Liam shoved her away, his eyes wild. "I didn't force your hand. You greedy vulture. You were so busy dreaming about your Italian villas you didn't even check the deed titles. You're just as guilty as I am." Jax was on the floor, literally hyperventilating. The playboy who thought his life would be a series of parties was now realizing he wouldn't even be able to afford a bus ticket out of the city. "The cars," he moaned. "At least let me keep the cars." The cars were the first thing the creditors flagged. "Jax," Sterling said, closing his briefcase with a final, metallic snap. "In fact, I believe there are recovery agents at the estate gates right now. They aren't here for the funeral. They're here for the collateral. Greed is a blindfold that feels like a silk ribbon until the moment it tightens into a noose." I walked over to the large bay window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. Below us, in the driveway where the fog was finally lifting, 3 black SUVs had pulled up. Men in dark suits were stepping out, not police, but the kind of private, asset recovery specialists that billionaires use when they've been cheated. "They're here," I said quietly. The siblings froze. The screaming stopped. A new, much deeper fear took hold. They looked at each other, and for the first time in their lives, they saw exactly what they were: 3 strangers tied together by a debt they could never pay. In a house that no longer belonged to them. Liam whispered, his voice cracking. "You were his favorite. He talked to you. He must have left a way out. A back door, a secret account. You can't let them take us. He did leave a way out. Liam, I said, turning to face them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished iron key. It didn't look like much. It looked like something you'd find at a flea market. He told me that if any one of you came to visit him in the hospital, just once, without asking about the will, I should give you this key. It opens a safe deposit box in Switzerland that contains enough clean, untraceable gold to start over. They stared at the key, their eyes burning with a desperate, pathetic hunger. Who did you give it to? Sophia asked, her voice trembling. No one, I said, closing my hand over the key. Because in 6 months of him dying in that bed, the only person who ever sat in that chair was me. You were too busy measuring the rooms in this house to notice that the man who built it was fading away. The greatest tragedy of the greedy isn't that they lose everything, it's that they realize they had everything they needed before they started reaching for more. I walked past them, my footsteps echoing in the hollow shell of the library. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the manor were being pounded on. The creditors were finished waiting. Mr. Sterling, I said as we reached the hallway. Is the car ready? It's out back, Leo, and the foundation papers are signed. You're officially the director of the Magnus Legacy Project. The real legacy. I nodded, stepping out into the cold, crisp air of the morning. I didn't look back at the screaming matches or the sound of breaking glass as the heirs realized the inheritance was actually their prison. I had a long drive ahead of me, and for the first time in 23 years, I was driving a car that I didn't have to return. Part 5, The Weight of the Key. While the heirs were busy fighting over a skeleton, I was the only one who walked away with the heart of the kingdom. The sound of the front doors being forced open echoed through the marble hallways like a gunshot. I didn't stop to look back. I knew what was happening. The recovery agents weren't there for a polite conversation. They were there to inventory every soul and every stick of furniture in that house. I could hear Sophia's high-pitched scream and Liam's desperate attempts to pull rank. But their voices were fading, swallowed by the vast, cold emptiness of the estate. I walked toward the rear of the property, passing the portraits of the Blackwood ancestors. For a century, this family had been defined by what they took from the world. My father, the only father I ever knew, had realized too late that he had raised 3 monsters in silk clothing. Inheritance isn't a gift, it's a mirror, and for the first time in their lives, the Blackwood siblings were forced to look at their own reflection. I reached the private conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with rare orchids and the scent of damp earth. In the center stood a small, unassuming stone pedestal. This was the place where Magnus spent his final healthy days. Staring out at the horizon, I looked at the iron key in my palm. It was cold, heavy, and carried the weight of a million unspoken words. My brothers and sister thought this key led to a vault of gold bars. They thought it was their get-out-of-jail-free card. But Magnus had taught me one final lesson before he drew his last breath. Leo, he had whispered, his grip tightening on my arm. Money is just paper. Power is just a shadow. True wealth is the ability to walk away when the world is burning and not feel a single flame. The most powerful man in the room isn't the one with the most money, it's the one who needs the least from it. I knelt beside the pedestal and felt for a small, hidden catch in the stone. A tiny compartment clicked open. Inside wasn't a map to a Swiss bank or a list of secret accounts. It was a simple, handwritten letter addressed to me, and a small, digital drive. I realized then that the secret vault the siblings were so obsessed with was never a physical room. It was a digital fortress. The zero-point energy patents they craved weren't just blueprints, they were the future of the energy industry. And Magnus had spent 20 years making sure they could never be sold to the highest bidder or exploited by greedy heirs. Part 6, The Final Revelation. The world thinks the story ends when the money runs out, but the real story begins when the truth is finally whispered. I walked to the back gate where a modest black sedan was waiting. Mr. Sterling was standing by the door, his face looking 10 years younger now that he was free from the Blackwood siblings' demands. He handed me a tablet. The transfer is complete, Leo, he said softly, the moment they signed those liability waivers. The ownership of the clean assets, the patents. the charity foundation, and the remaining liquid reserves, moved into your name. By law, you are no longer an employee or a stray. You are the sole executor of the Magnus legacy. I looked back at the mansion. From this distance, it looked like a tomb. I could see the blue lights of the federal vehicles beginning to swarm the front entrance. They wanted a crown, so Magnus gave them one. He just forgot to tell them it was made of lead. What will happen to them? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The debt they signed for is legally binding, Sterling replied, checking his watch. The creditors will take the houses, the cars, and the jewelry. The federal government will take the rest to cover the back taxes. Liam, Sophia, and Jax will spend the next 20 years in a courtroom trying to explain why they accepted $3 billion in criminal liability for a handful of empty hotels. I climbed into the back seat of the car. I opened the tablet and looked at the digital drive's contents. It wasn't just money, it was a list of every employee Magnus had ever fired to appease his children's greed. A list of every small business the Blackwood Group had crushed. Revenge isn't about hurting people. It's about fixing what they broke while they watch you do it. Where to, sir? The driver asked. I looked at the iron key one last time before tossing it out the window and into the tall grass of the meadow. I didn't need it anymore. The key wasn't the prize, the freedom was. To the city, I said, we have a lot of people to pay back. And tell the foundation to prepare a press release. The Blackwood Group is dead. The Magnus Foundation is officially open for business. As the car pulled away, I saw the silhouette of the mansion disappear into the fog. I thought about that one sentence the lawyer read. The sentence that froze their hearts and ended their reign. Who deserves what, shall receive exactly that. In the end, they got the fame, the headlines, and the name. I got the life they were too busy to live. The engine hummed as we hit the open road. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at the rearview mirror. I was looking at the horizon, where the sun was finally starting to burn through the mist. The story of the greedy heirs was over. My story was just beginning. The best way to win a game against people who cheat is to let them win the wrong prize.